Hello everyone, Kit here, back with another video. Today for you guys I'm going to read into Deciding to Use Force Abroad, War Powers in a System of Checks and Balances document. I'll leave a link to this down in the description below along with my email. You can email us at themuns@gmail.com for private consultation. And yeah, without further ado, let me get right into it. The War Powers Initiative of the Constitution Project. Summary of recommendations. Congress must perform its constitutional duty to reach a deliberate and transparent collective judgment about initiating the use of force abroad, except when force is used for a limited range of defensive purposes. The President must seek advance authorization from Congress for initiating the use of force abroad, except when force is used for a limited range of defensive purposes. To obtain the informed collective judgment of Congress on initiating the use of force abroad, the President should supply Congress with circumstances permit, with timely and complete information about a use of force abroad. The President should supply Congress, when circumstances permit, with timely and complete information about the use of a force, and Congress should also use its own investigatory tools to determine the reliability and completeness of the information on which it relies to reach a collective judgment. Congress should authorize initiating use of force abroad and only by declaration of war or specific statute or appropriation, except that it can be more generally authorized clandestine counter-terrorist operations that require secrecy and speed, provided it states clearly the purposes and scope of the authorization. Although Congress can condition its authorization for the use of force on compliance with international law or treaty obligations or consultation with international organizations, it should not and cannot delegate the use of force decision to an international body. Authorization by a treaty organization, international body, or international law is not a constitutional substitute for authorization from Congress. Congress should replace the War Powers Resolution with legislation that fairly acknowledges the President's defensive war powers, omits any arbitrary general time limit on deployments of force, reaffirms the constitutionally derived clear statement rule for use of force bills, and prescribes rules for the privileged and expedited consideration. Congress should update and clarify the almost 200 standby statutory authorities triggered variously and often ambiguously by declared war, war alone, time of war, or national emergency, and it should codify selected laws of war. Congress does not complete its war powers duties by authorizing a use of force abroad. It should also conduct appropriate and regular oversight of the strategic use of force, monitor the domestic legal effects of the authorization, and when appropriate, revise or rescind the authorization or stand by legal authorities the authorization triggers. To preserve the system of checks and balances of which war powers are part, the federal court should, in appropriate cases, decide whether the authority exists for the use of force abroad. To preserve the system of checks and balances which war powers are part, the federal court should, in appropriate cases, decide whether authority exists for the use of force abroad. Changing national security threats. The focus of threats to our national security has shifted since 1789 from threats posed by foreign states, foreign invasion, and insurrection to threats posed by international terrorist organizations, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and the collapse of government and order in failed states. The original threats. When they wrote the Constitution, the framers were chiefly focused on the threats posed by European states, especially Great Britain, France, and Spain, domestic insurrection, and Native Americans. They had, of course, just fought a lengthy war with Great Britain and still look uneasily at French military outposts to the west, English outposts to the north, and Spanish outposts to the south. When the farmers gave Congress the authority to declare war, to grant letters of marque, and reprisal to privateers who would augment public armed forces, they envisioned chiefly war and reprisal against foreign states. But insecure in the authority and the strength of the new federal government they had created, they also provided for calling out the militia to suppress insurrections and to repel hostile attacks by Native Americans along the infant country's vast borders. Number 2. Threats in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Foreign states continued to pose the greatest threat to our national security throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The first war fought by the United States was the undeclared but congressionally authorized naval war with France in 1798. The first declared war was against Great Britain in 1812. We declared war against Mexico and Spain before the end of the century, and then in 1917 against Germany and Austria-Hungary, which brought us into World War I. The threat of insurrection also materialized on a small scale in the Whiskey Rebellion of 1784, and then on a large scale in the Civil War in 1861. In sheer numbers, however, the 19th century was dominated by lesser threats from pirates, smugglers, bandits, and other non-state actors. The framers had anticipated threat from piracy by expressly giving Congress authority to define and punish piracies and other offenses against the law of nations. Congress quickly enacted 10 statutes authorizing President Jefferson and Madison to use force against the Barbary pirates, before enacting general legislation authorizing presidents to use naval forces to suppress pirates. As the century wore on, the breakdown of law and order in foreign states also increasingly posed threats to American diplomatic missions and private citizens. Presidents often acted unilaterally to respond to these threats by ordering the rescue and protection of Americans abroad when foreign governments could not or would not. In the 20th century, presidents also invoked the resulting claim of protective invention to intervene on behalf of the U.S. commercial and financial interests in Central and South America and the Caribbean. Number 3. Threats after World War II. After the formally declared war against foreign states in World War II, the establishment of the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization led to a change both in the charterization of international threats and the mechanism for responding to them. Although the Cold War was dominated by conventional foreign state threats posed by the Soviet Union and war-scarred pact countries, new threats to international or regional peace and stability arose indirectly affecting U.S. interests. Just as the threats were now often internationalized, that is, directed at international, not just national security, so too was the president's claim of authority. In Korea, an American president responded for the first time in our history with a massive and sustained armed force to a threat posed by a foreign state without seeking a declaration of war or specific authorization from Congress. Instead, some proponents of the use of force in Korea cited authorization from the United States Security Council. In 1990, some proponents of the Operation Desert Storm cited similar authorization for the president to send almost 500,000 U.S. troops to oust Iraq from Kuwait before he obtained congressional authorizations. In 1999, President Clinton ordered U.S. airplanes to join in coalition with our NATO allies in launching airstrikes on the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia without prior congressional authorization after they have been ordered by the NATO Secretary General. In these cases, an asserting justification of the use of force abroad that was authorized by international organization or by international law to enforce international peace and security. 4. Current threats. Over the last 2 decades, the threat of international terrorism has come to dominate the national security debate. In the 1980s, this was seen as a new form of the old threat posed by foreign states, because most acts of international terrorism appeared to be state-sponsored. In 1986, Libya sponsored a terrorist bombing that took the life of U.S. servicemen, and President Reagan retaliated with an airstrike. The 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, the 1988 attacks on U.S. embassies in Africa, the 2000 attack on the USS Cole, and finally the 9/11 attacks, signaled a qualitative change in the terrorist threat from the state-sponsored terrorism to terrorism by non-state actors, openly, largely out of safe havens in failed states in which there was no central authority capable for maintaining order. Although foreign states still present threats as sanctuaries or hosts for such terrorists, Afghanistan, or in some cases in their own right or as actual or aspiring nuclear powers, North Korea and Iran, The continuing threat of terrorist attacks by international criminal groups with varying degrees of state support, training, or protection holds first place among national security threats to the United States, now and for the foreseeable future. The possibility that terrorists will acquire and deploy weapons of mass destruction to attack U.S. targets heightens the threat. The changing threats to our national security, however, have not changed the allocation of their constitutional war powers. While new threats may change the kind of force that was authorized, the identity of the enemy, or the optical form of authorization they required, no change in the principles by which our government should decide whether to initiate the use of force abroad. The system of checks and balances is no less necessary today for the constitutional exercise of war powers than it was in 1789, as we discuss next. The constitutional understanding. War powers in the system of checks and balances. The Constitution provides four major checks on the exercise of war powers: the collective judgment, spending limitations on unintentional civilian command, and judicial review. The decision to use armed force abroad, except for a limited range of defensive purposes, must be made in advance by the collective judgment of Congress and the President in order to promote deliberation, political consensus, and the political accountability for the use of force. Congress at all times controls the power of the purse, which it can use to terminate a use of force, conditioned only by the Commander-in-Chief's inherent authority to remove our troops safely. As this condition illustrates, Congress's war power cannot intrude on the Commander-in-Chief's tactical command of the day-to-day operations of the armed forces. Finally, the courts are available to decide the question of authority for use of force, both incidentally and deciding the legal effects of war and uses of force on civil and property rights, and directly where there is no reasonable prospect for that further action by either or both of the political branches would avoid the question. The following discussion explores these checks by examining the constitutional role of each branch in turn, as well as the roles as international organizations and international law in the operation of our war powers. Number 1. The Congress's constitutional role in war powers. Collective judgment. The framers shared the view that an absolute monarch would be prone to squandering his subjects' lives and money on reckless military adventures. Absolute monarchs, John Jay wrote in the Federalist Papers, will often make war when their nations are to get nothing by it, but for purposes and objects merely personal, such as thirst for military glory, revenge for personal affronts, ambition, or private compacts to agonize or support their particular families or partitions. The best precaution against unliteral war-making by the executive was to require a collective decision to go to war. It will not be in the power of a single man or a single body of men to involve us in such distress, for the important power of declaring war is vested in the legislature at large. James Wilson later explained to the Pennsylvania ratifying convention. Moreover, vesting this power in the whole Congress meant that the properly elected House, the body most directly responsive to the voters, had to act and so help to assure the wildest possible political consensus for war. The Senate, originally chosen by the state legislatures, could not alone provide this assurance, since the people could not be asked directly whether the nation should go to war, requiring the assent of the House as well, as the Senate was the next thing. If presidents bent on war could not persuade the Congress, they presumably could not persuade the people either, and would therefore lack the consensus required to assume the costs and risks of war. In short, the framers insisted on a collective judgment for war because it was likely that a collective judgment would be superior to an individual judgment, would help assure that the United States would not go to war without a political consensus, and by requiring a president to persuade Congress, would effectively make him or her explain why war was necessary to the public who would ultimately bear its cost. The reasons for insisting on a collective judgment for war are still valid today. Declaring war by words or action. For foregoing reasons, the Constitution assigns to the full Congress the power to declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal. According to the international law in 1789, a state could declare war either by word or action, as the influential political theorist John Locke put it. A state publicly announce the state of war by war, making a formal declaration of war and delivering it to the enemy. A state initiated a state of war by action, simply by committing an act of war. Congress is thus empowered to formally declare war, as it has 11 times in 5 conflicts. It declared war individually on several foreign states in each world war, with biometrical approval and presentment of the declaration to the President for its signature, while through Congress as a legislative body cannot itself also commit an act of war. It can authorize the President to act instead. The assignment of the declaration power to Congress thus gives it not only the power to announce a state of war by formal declaration, but also to pass legislation authorizing the President to initiate war by using force. Furthermore, the Constitution also vests in Congress the authority to grant letters of marque and reprisal to privateers, to use force or to seize enemy property in retaliation for an injury to the United States. The Constitution therefore assigns Congress control over a wide spectrum of force, not only decision for what the framers call perfect war, pitting all the nation's resources and armed forces against an enemy state, but also the decision to commit lesser acts of war as well as acts of reprisal. While a substantial majority of the war powers initiative believe that this authority is exclusively legislative, the dissenter views it as it most concurrent. By the dissenting view, while Congress can authorize war by declaration or legislation, by its authorization is not necessary for the President to use force against what he or she views as a threat to the vital national security interests of the United States, regardless of how large or long-lasting the use of force, and regardless of how much time it is to seek congressional authorization. While a substantial majority of the war powers initiative believe that this authority is exclusively legislative, the dissenter views it at its most concurrent. By the dissenting view, while Congress can or authorize war by declaration or legislation, this authorization is not necessary for the President to use force against what he or she views a threat to the vital national security interests of the United States, regardless of how large or long-lasting the use of force, and regardless of how much time there is to seek congressional authorization. As Commander-in-Chief and the sole organ for foreign affairs, Presidents have the constitutional authority to identify to such threats, using force as they deem necessary for the President to use force against what he or she views of the national security of the United States. Presidents have the constitutional authority to identify and respond to such threats, using such force as they deem necessary. Under the dissenting view, the declaration of war clause is intended to require Congress's consent to certain acts, declaring war or legalizing captures that had legal implications such as changing the rights of neutrals or the relationships between states. Declare was not a code word for requiring Congress's authorization for all uses of force. The framers, after all, voted to change the proposed constitutional text vesting war by power in Congress to make war or declare war, thus reducing the authority of Congress by authorizing the President to defend against sudden attacks without his consent. James Madison's notes of the debate on the Declaration Clause in the Constitutional Convention are appended as Appendix A. By the dissenting view, presidents do not need the congressional authorization for the wars against Iraq in 1991 and 2003, even through time permitted seeking such authorization, or for the use of military force in Afghanistan in 2001, because in these cases they were responding to what they considered to be the threats to our vital national security interests. By contrast, under this dissenting view, President Clinton did need congressional authorization for the air campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, FRY, in 1999, because he had not made the case that the FRY threatened a vital national security interest of the United States. The majority of the War Powers Initiative believes that the dissenters' theory of constitutional war powers is inconsistent with the framers' contemporary usage and understanding of declare war, the system of checks and balances in which war powers must be exercised, and historical practice up until the Korean War. The dissenters' theory would allow precisely what the framers tried to guard against: a single person making the life or death decision to use force on a massive and sustained scale, even when there has been no attack on us and there is an ample time for a collective, deliberative, and accountable decision by the legislature. The dissenter's differentiation of cases adds an additional reason for rejecting his view. President Clinton justified the air campaign against the Fry and as essential to preserving the credibility of NATO, the cornerstone on which our security has rested for 50 years, and to preventing key U.S. allies from being drawn into a wider conflict, a war we would be forced to confront later, only at far greater risk and greater cost. While one can disagree with President Clinton's assessment of the threat to our national security posed by the war in the Balkans, there is no standard for deciding between the President's assessment and the dissenter's contrary assignment, and therefore no basis under the dissenting view for determining when the President's unliteral use of force is authorized. That is why the majority believes that the Constitution entrusts the threat assessment in deciding to initiate the use of force abroad to the collective judgment on the political branches, on the premise that, absent that any agreed standard, the many are more likely to get it right than just one. The dissenting view rejects and premise and entrusts the threat assessment and resulting decision on force entirely to a single person, unless, apparently, the President's threat assessment is wrong by some subjective and undefined standard. While the Constitution does not prescribe the form of congressional approval for the use of force abroad, it does require Congress to enact the approval either by formal declaration or statute. The desirability of deliberation, political consensus, and political accountability also suggests that authorization for the use of force should be as specific as a formal declaration. In other words, to achieve the purposes of the Declaration Clause, an authorization must be clear and explicit. Authorization by general implication does not achieve these purposes. Joint resolutions or other statutes expressly authorizing the use of force statutes, and appropriations specifically earmarked for the use of force meet this standard. General appropriations for military personnel or mutilations or collateral legislation dealing with the draft, military pay, or military procurement often will not, depending on their wording, timing, and legislative history. Congressional actions do not satisfy the Article 1 requirements for the enactment of law by miracle approval and presentment to the President, such as simple or concurrent resolutions but not joint resolutions, cannot change legal rights and duties outside the legislative branch according to the Supreme Court. They cannot therefore operate in place of formal declarations or use of force statutes to satisfy the Declaration Clause either. The dissenting member of the War Powers Initiative agrees that the principles in the foregoing paragraph are prudent, and but not that they are constitutionally mandated, because the President does not need advance congressional authorization to protect vital national security interests in the first place. Under the dissenting view, it does not matter what form Congress chooses to express its constitutionally necessary, albeit politically desirable, concurrence. The dissenter therefore treats formal declarations, specific use of force statutes, and lesser forms of congressional action, including simple and concurrent resolutions, as constitutionally, if not prudently, equivalent for purposes expressing Congress's view about the President's decision to use force to protect the vital national interests. The majority of the War Powers Initiative rejects the dissenting view as inconsistent with the purpose of the Declare War Clause, Article 1 process for making law affecting duties and relations outside the legislative branch, and the fundamental constitutional and democratic premises of the accountability and transparency. All members of the War Powers Initiative agree that a clear statement rule of authorization is prudent. The majority also believes that clear statement rule serves the constitutional purposes and of legislative deliberation and political accountability, in decisions to initiate the use of force abroad, and it is therefore a logical corollary of the Declare War Clause, fairly constructed, and Article 1 in which it appears. The country's first war, the Naval War or Quasi-War with France from 1978 to 1800, illustrates several of the foregoing principles of war authorization. Uneasy about going to war with an erstwhile ally and world-class military power that was so popular with large segments of the population, President John Adams approached Congress cautiously for limited authority to defend against French attacks on American shipping. After a lengthy debate on the merits, Congress first passed a statute simply authorizing defensive measures off the coast. When these proved insufficient, the temper of the people rose, in resentment of the accumulated wrongs. Congress escalated gradually by enacting a statute authorizing the president to seize armed French vessels on the high seas. As a result, the country was now in a state of war, as Rep. Edward Livingston, DNY, said during debates in 1798, "Let no man flatter himself that the vote which he has given for use of force statute is not declaration of war." The war was never formally declared. The Supreme Court later unanimously found that Congress had lawfully authorized a limited, imperfect naval war. The Appropriations Power. The Naval War with France also highlighted another of Congress's war powers, because Congress had to enact appropriations for naval vessels needed for the effort. The authority to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a navy gives Congress a powerful check on war and the use of force by giving a sole authority to finance the armed forces and munitions needed to conduct war. As Nathaniel Gorsham stressed at the Philadelphia Convention, by these provisions, the means of carrying on the war would not be in the hands of the president, but of the legislature. To the same effect, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We have already given an example, one effectual check to the dog of war by transferring the power of letting him loose from the executive to the legislative body, from those who are to spend for those who are to pay." The appropriation power not only augmented the prior check of advance authorization by Congress, it also provided a subsequent check by enabling Congress to stop the use of force by cutting off its funding. Today, that check is augmented by the Anti-Deficiency Act, which prohibits an expenditure or obligation of funds not appropriated by the Congress and by legislation that criminalizes violations of the Act. Limits on the Congressional War Power. The Congressional War Power is not limited. It is always subject to other provisions of the Constitution and cannot, for example, be used to deny rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. It cannot be used to assume day-to-day tactical command of the armed forces, which it would violate Article 2's designation of the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Furthermore, the Congressional War Power is also affected by practical and political limits. Limits on the information available to Congress in making a decision to use force, limits on the time for deliberation, and limits on the political feasibility of cutting off funds for U.S. troops in the field. Finally, the creation of a huge military capacity, ironically standing army that most of the framers and the members of the first Congress to stoutly resisted has left the appropriations power as largely an ex-post control on the president. Number 2. President's constitutional role in war powers. That's the last one I'm going to do. Tactical command. The core of the president's war power is summarized in a single sentence. He shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and the militia of the several states, when called into the actual service of the United States. The framers had experienced the dangerous inefficiencies of command by committee during the early years of the Revolutionary War. The Congress are not a fit body to act as council of war, Samuel Chase wrote. They are too large, too slow, and the resolutions can never be kept secret. Alright guys, I'm going to end it off here. I'll see you guys in the next video. I'll leave the link to this down in the description below. Along with our email, you can email us at thebuzz@gmail.com for a private consultation. And I'll see you guys later. Like, subscribe, and have a nice day.